All right, shalom, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rachat Wadash. Giving double honors to the elders and apostles at Great Millstone who taught me this truth. Peace and salutations to the hopeful elect. Peace and salutations to the Akim, the brethren out there on the highways and byways who are pushing this truth in 100% sincerity. And peace and salutations to the few and sincere sisters who believe in this gospel. So I want to entitle this lesson, the goal is to quiet the Israelite man, right? And what I mean by that is when you look out into society and you look out in the world, especially on social media, you know, like TikTok, Instagram and things like that, especially, shout out to Elder Manata Zagba, who has been posting a lot of videos online on the internet about how the average everyday Jake, Israelite, is number one, coming against the truth, right? That's the main thing, coming against the truth, the men of the Lord, and telling us we don't need to be teaching on the streets. We don't need to be preaching. We don't need to be speaking on the Bible as we speak of it, right? Because this word is cutting to them. This word to them is, as a sharp sword, as it says in the book of Hebrews. This word is like a two-edged sword. So a lot of these people that are out here, man, they're cut. They're cut when it comes to the word. They're cut when it comes to us bringing out the scriptures. So they have a reaction of get us off the streets. We don't need to be teaching. We don't need to be preaching. And they're expressing their contempt and their dislike or even hatred for the truth, the ministry, and the men who preach this truth on the streets, right? On the streets of Babylon. They're professing, how much they dislike us. You know what I'm saying? They're telling us on social media how much they dislike us and how much they don't want to hear the word, right? Going even further than that, just the Israelite man in general who speaks up about particular issues, who speaks up on what's going on out here in the world, and is open and vocal about, righteousness and what needs to be done here in Babylon, or not even just here in Babylon, just here in the world in general, right? A man like that is told that he doesn't need to speak, right? A man like that is either slandered. A man like that is either shamed to try and get him to submit, even to the point where people create false narratives, right? And I got a video on YouTube, and just watch the video and listen to the deception, right? Because they're talking about the whole, it's a known fact that Eve, the so-called black woman, she decided to leave the home to take on government benefits in hopes of a better in hopes of a quote-unquote better quality life, right? And as we see, we see the results of that. It didn't turn out that way, right? But it's a known fact that Eve, so-called black woman, did leave the household, right? But as this video I'm about to show, they're about to twist it and say, well, because of food stamps, Eve kicked the man out the house because of food stamps. No one has ever said because of food stamps, right? It's really going into public housing. Right, public housing was really the first thing. Food stamps and EBT, welfare, and all that stuff that came as other benefits. But the main thing was public housing, your living situation. When you look back in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, even though we did have self-sufficient communities, which I'm gonna look more into it because they try and make it seem like Jake was just living in squalor and slums and everything like that. And I'm gonna look more into it because, Jake had a lot of self-sufficient communities back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and earlier. Number one reason, because we were forced to, right? You have the Jim Crow laws and what was called the Jim Crow de facto laws, right? Which the Jim Crow laws were implemented in the southern states, and they were de facto, meaning that they weren't written into law, but the practice was there. You know, that's what it means, de facto. But it's like you're going back into the video that I'm about to play. You know, they're gonna say that Eve left the home because of food, or Eve kicked the black man out because of food stamps, right? And it wasn't that. It was because of, you know, public housing benefits. You know, they marketed to Esau marketed to Eve that you know, you can live in paradise, or you can have your, you know, poor man's or poor woman's penthouse, you know, moving into some of these housing projects. And a good documentary on that is the Pruitt-Igoe myth, right? And you can watch that documentary, I believe, on Amazon Prime, I think. I watched it the other day. But that's a good documentary that talks just about that. You know, that whole thing, because that happened here in St. Louis, Missouri, right? And, you know, that was a trend in all of the major cities. You know, especially up in the Midwest and the Northeast, having these housing projects and things like that, right? But here it is. I'm without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and play this video. Lord willing, this lesson be edifying.
That food stamps kept black men out of the home. Can you address that really quick?
The no man in the household rule. At one point, there was this rule that if you had a man in the house, you couldn't get access to food stamps. I want to be clear, welfare.
And that was false, right? In terms of they couldn't get access to food stamps. No, it was public housing, right? It was public housing. There was a stipulation, and you can look it up, but there was a stipulation when the public housing thing started, that there could be no able-bodied man in the home. You know, there could be no able-bodied man living in a home, and they would even have, I guess you can call them social workers, come in and check up on and check on the house, you know. And they break this down in that documentary, the Pruitt-Igoe myth. But they would have people come and check up on the house to see, you know, if there were, basically to see if there were things that a hard-working man could afford that was in the house, right? So they would say things like, I guess in those days, items that were kind of new or kind of expensive, like, I guess like a coffee maker, blenders, you know, things like that, household items that we get for $30, $40, $50 today. You know, those things were just, you know, they were kind of new back then, so they were a little bit more expensive. And typically only a man who is working can afford those things at that time. So they would look for those items, and, you know, they could potentially lose those housing benefits if a man was to be found living in a home. But it had nothing to do with food stamps, though. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to say a truth and a lie at the same time. They're trying to say a truth and saying that so-called black men left the home, but a lie to say that we're saying it's because of food stamps. That's not the case, right?
Programs begin with mother's pension back in the early 1900s. And guess who didn't have access to that? Black women. You would have a character test, and they would decide if you were able to get access to these services. Then when FDR comes around and broadens a bit, but nonetheless, you still have black women getting kicked out of it. But it opens up more. And by 1968, there was a Supreme Court case that strikes down the no man in the house rule that says that if you have a man in the house, you can still get access to these benefits. But it was this idea that all these black women were kicking their husbands out of the home because they wanted their food stamps. I don't know any woman that will kick a man out of the house, a good man out of the house, just to get access to food stamps.
Not for $300.
Not for $300, right? So, and it's one of these things that the likes of Byron Donalds and Tim Scott says, oh, the food stamps are just.
See, they're saying no one has ever said that so-called black women kick black men out the home for food stamps. And black women didn't kick the man out the home. They left the home. They left the home to go and take on the crumbs that Esau gave them, which was what? The public housing projects, right? Because they perceived that, and really, what it really is, because they perceived that they would have a better quality of life, quote unquote. But really what it was, they perceived that whatever that Esau would give them is better than what Jake had to offer, even if it's Esau's crumbs. That's what really they perceived, and that's one of the main reasons that they chose to go and take on those public housing benefits, right? And the design was to keep the man out the home. It was, they'll say that it was a good intent, but with things like that, and you checking up to see if there's a man in the home, right? We all know that the best thing would be to keep families together. The best thing for community would be to keep families together, you know, man, woman, children, you know, in a functional household. That would be the best thing for communities, right? But when you, number one, when you know the psychology of, because remember, slavery was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was less than 100 years removed at that time, right? They knew who their niggas was. They knew who they niggas was. The Willie Lynch letter. You can still see a lot of what was written in the Willie Lynch letter in society today. Why? Because it was a deliberate plan and plot. Really witchcraft, right? To put these things on Jake. So they would know going forward, even decades and hell, even centuries down the line, they know who they have under their thumb. So they know the mindset. They knew the mindset of Eve. They knew because of years, hundreds of years of slavery. And Slacky, I'm gonna get into the scriptures here soon, right? But they knew because of what they've done and how they programmed us in slavery, and how that programming passed down from generation to generation to generation. They knew that Eve would look at Esau as the top dog, and whatever he had to offer was going to be better than what Jake had to offer. Even if what Jake had to offer was actually better than what Esau had to offer, they because of, they look at these Edomites, so-called white people, as their gods, right? They knew that they would take anything that they would give them, right? But let's keep going.
Kept black people in poverty. The majority of people, nothing wrong with food stamps. Nothing wrong with it at all.
Yeah.
But the majority of folks on food stamps, even per capita, happen to be white. And I'm not shaming white folks who are on food stamps. But this is not a black issue. Welfare is not a black issue. EBT is not a black issue. It's a poverty issue.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So don't try to
say that.
That's what it really is. So that no man in the house, and it was struck down in 1968 by a black woman in Alabama. She's the one that started the case. So all these.
So now, Salakia. Now he's admitting. Now, do you see the deception? He's admitting that there was a no man in the house rule. And they're saying that it was struck down in 1968, which is true. That is true. But after how long, though? You have to ask yourself that question. After how long? Remember, the whole public housing thing started in the 40s. if not the late 30s, but I believe it started in the early 40s. And I think the first public housing project, I believe, was in Atlanta, Georgia. The very first one. Right? And what made the Pruitt-Igoe one here in St. Louis so significant was because it was the worst one. Right? It only stood for 20 years, and in 1970, between 1972 and 74 was when it was demolished. Shortly after 1968, but when you watch the documentary, it was run down and basically uninhabitable by the time that they demolished it in less than 20 years. Right? So the no man in the house rule was struck down in 1968, but you got to ask yourself, okay, what are the effects of it? What were the effects of it for the time that rule wasn't standing? And that rule wasn't standing for more than a decade, definitely, maybe a little less than 2 decades, if not 2 decades, if not 20 years. So yes, it is true that the man in the house rule was struck down in 1968. But you got to take into account all of the things prior to that, right? But here, I'm going to go ahead, enough of my rant. I'm going to go ahead and get into the scriptures. Salakia, this is Isaiah chapter 29 and verse 19. It says, the meek also shall increase their joy in the Lord, and the poor among men shall rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. For the terrible one is brought to naught, and the scorner is consumed, and all that watch for iniquity are cut off, right? And this is talking about Esau, Edom. It says, that make a man an offender for a word, and lay a snare for him that reproveth in the gate, and turn aside the just for a thing of naught, right? See, they make a man an offender for a word. They make a man an offender for just speaking, and speaking truth, For example, when it comes to these, these Jehus, these Izzies, right? They like to come against people when people acknowledge that they are really the most powerful group of people in the world, along with being the most powerful group of Edomites in the world, and when you look a lot of things up, they own a lot of these major corporations, a lot of these major, and they have influence in these, things that are, making everyday decisions for people in this world. And when you acknowledge that, that's anti-Semitism. Call halal Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai 1044. But when you acknowledge that, they'll say, oh, that's anti-Semitism, or that's hate speech. They want to take your videos down. They want to silence you. And we've seen that here in this truth. These people, they want to silence the men of the Lord for speaking truth to power, speaking about what's really going on and relating it to the scriptures, filtering it through the scriptures, breaking it down and showing you that prophecy has said that these things were going to happen. They really can't stand when they see Jake doing that too, because Jake, really, you're not supposed to be no more than a nigga on the corner, having a bunch of babies, don't have no knowledge or education, no intelligence, basically just a human monkey. And the hood is supposed to be the circus, right? Run by the so-called black woman. That's really what you're supposed to be as a nigga in the society's eyes. But when you actually got some sense, some intelligence, and you speak, and you're not afraid to speak on truth, now that's a problem. That's an issue now, right? It says that make a man an offender for a word, and lay a snare for him that reproveth in the gate, and turn aside the just for a thing of naught, right? Like it is the book of Mark 3 and verse 27. And it reads, it says, no man can enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he will first bind the strong man, and he will spoil his house, right? That's the number one, well, not the number one, but one of the responsibilities and duties of a man is to take proper measures to make sure that his house is protected. You know what I'm saying? You know, even before danger presents itself, a man is supposed to make sure that his house is protected by all means. You know, the best way he can possibly can, right? And then when danger does arise, let's say somebody breaks into your house, you know, a strong man is going to defend his house, and he's not going to make it easy for a motherfucker to just come in and rob him, you know, kill his wife, kill his kids, and take what he has. He's not going to make it easy, you know. But when you figure out a way to systematically remove that man, because when you remove a man, right, a real man, a man who strategizes, a man who is intelligent, a man who understands his role as a protector, right, and provider, and provision don't just go into finances, right? Really, the scriptures don't even really mention anything about a man's provision being finances, right? But we understand that the man is to take care of his household. So we know, you know, a man, he goes out and he makes sure that his family is fed, you know? But when you take that aspect, when you take that factor away, you leave the rest of the house vulnerable. Number one reason being is because the woman, she's emotional. You know, she has some capabilities of being a protector or defending, but the woman, she's not really going to go against the grain. She's not really going to go against something. Typically, the only time you see that is when you see her being under the leadership of a man. For example, I watched this movie for the first time, Judas, the movie about Fred Hampton, right? And I watched that for the first time. He had, you know, his wife, but you know, she was inspired by the cause, but her willingness to resist, it really came from being under the leadership of a man like Fred Hampton. Because when a man deals with a woman, when a strong man deals with a woman, he's putting his spirit on her, so she becomes like him. But when you remove the man, you know, the woman is emotional, and she's really looking for an easy way out. She's really looking for an easy way out. And usually the easy way out is to surrender and submit, right? So she's typically, the woman is not going to come against the powers that be. And the children don't know no better. You know, so the children typically aren't a threat, you know, until they become older. But if you program the woman to raise children who are docile, especially when it comes to the men, but to raise young men who are docile, submissive, they go along to get along, weak, then yeah, you have nothing to worry about at that point. But that's because the strong man has been removed. The book of Jeremiah, chapter 31 and verse 22, it says, how long wilt thou go about, O thou backsliding daughter? For the Lord hath created a new thing in the earth. A woman shall compass a man, right? Which means a woman is going to be placed over the man, right? We live in a society where everything is about women. Everything is about women's emotions. Everything is about their box, how they look, girl power, all this shit, right? because we live in a feminized society in Babylon, right? To the point to where you've got so many weak men out here that they become women worshipers. They become box worshipers, right? And they do anything to appease women to get the box, placing themselves under the woman. But that also comes from the social programming of, you gotta, a woman is a woman naturally is righteous. A woman is naturally, something of God. You got even a black conscious community who will say the black woman is God, right? So you got all of these narratives going on that promote woman worship. And by nature of the woman worship, you put the man above the woman. So you have a society of weak men who put women above them. Whereas in ancient times, things like this were never the norm. Now, you've had instances where men have, been simps for women, have run out of their wits for women. It even speaks about that in the book of First Esdras. Many men run out of their wits for women, and women have caused them to sin. Right? It's because what? Because they look at women as above them. And that's especially true in the so-called black community, right? Where, it's all about mama. It's all about the single, the strong single mother, right? And then you got that deadbeat baby daddy. That nigga ain't shit because, he left his family, he left his kids. Even though his woman was unruly, she's a bitch, she's hard to deal with. He left his family, so he's a deadbeat. But yet she can leave her family. Oh, she's pursuing her happiness. She's putting her happiness first. She's doing what's best for her mental health, all this other shit, right? So that's what that's going into. So what is this also giving? It's giving women liberty, as the scriptures say, liberty to get abroad, right? But this is quote unquote liberated women, right? From being under the structure of men. And that is also weakening the men too, right? To where women really look at a lot of men as expendable or disposable, easily replaced, something or somebody who is not valuable. And women run across these types of men all day, every day. So she looks at niggas like, okay, she'll go around and knock them down and move on from one to the next. Where typically when women deal with a strong man, typically she really wants to, a lot of times she really only wants to deal with that strong man, right? And it's not to say that women don't have their own sexual desires or nothing like that, but women will forego those sexual desires and sacrifice those things so that she can stay under the leadership of this strong man, right? But here it is. Amos chapter 7 and verse 16, it says, "Now therefore hear thou the word of the Lord. Thou sayest, prophesy not against Israel, and drop not thy word against the house of Isaac. Therefore thus saith the Lord, thy wife shall be an harlot in the city, and thy sons and thy daughters shall fall by the sword." Right? So it says, thy wife shall be a harlot in the city. What's the main thing that you go out and see on the weekends and Friday nights and all that stuff? You see a lot of women outside, dressed scantily clad, with them bosoms and bottoms out, flaunting it out to the world. And what are they looking for? They're looking for a ride. They're looking for You know what I'm saying? They out there on the streets looking for ride, right? They're looking for somebody who they can get it in with, right? That's just the conditions that we live in today. Is this is how this world is, right? But in the ancient time, that wasn't a such thing. In the ancient time, there was a lot more order and structure. There wasn't nightclubs per se like we have today. You know what I'm saying? Most people did their business during the day and they were in the house by night. Most women typically were married off at young ages, and the family had a hand in, choosing the right mate for the person. Whereas in today, she's got, all the options in the world of who she wants to choose to be with. And a lot of times she doesn't make the right choices. We see a lot of women choose based off of emotions. They choose men based off of how they feel about that man. And that man may be able to turn her on sexually, but he may not be good for her outside of that. He may be even highly destructive for her. But hey, a lot of times women, they'll deal with that if, you know what I'm saying, he knocking them boots the right way. Right? Verse 17, it says, "Therefore thus saith the Lord, thy wife shall be an harlot in the city, and thy sons and thy daughters shall fall by the sword, and thy land shall be divided by line, and there shalt die in a polluted land, and Israel shall surely go into captivity forth of this land," right? So, again, the ultimate objective is to silence truth. And who typically speaks truth? Men typically speak truth because they have the bravery to go against the system, to go against the grain, to go against the what was that term? The standard quo. I'm probably saying it wrong, so like you. But go against what's already established. So with that being said, Lord willing, this video lesson was edifying. Giving all praises to Yahweh, Bahashem Yahweh Shai, Bahashem Rachakadash. Until next time, shalom.